Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Very nice to be here. My first time in Savannah, shkach to the Skonim. I just have to start by saying the shul, I can't even call it a shul, the palace next door is, wow, worth coming here just to see that. Well, I must say, I'm glad I'm not speaking in there. I would just be too intimidated. That thing behind me. Absolutely beautiful. Traditionally, we refer to this period of time, the time period between Shivasa B'Tammuz and Tish'a B'Av, as Bein HaMetzorim. And the source for this title, for this period, comes from a pasuk in Eicha, where the pasuk says, Kol Reitveh Yisidua Bein HaMetzorim, which means all of those who were pursuing them were able to catch them in the narrow straits. Try to envision it, people trying to escape a city that's being destroyed and burned, and they're hiding between this wall on one side and a narrow something on the other side, and they get caught. That's the visuals that the pasuk is trying to describe. All of those who were chasing after them were able to catch them bein hamipsarim in the narrow straits. And we consider this whole period of time to be exactly that. It's a narrow straits that we have to make our way through and deal with the consequences of. And so the title is very apropos. It is indeed a time that we sense almost bein hamitzarim. And it's an incredible feat that our Chachamim were able to do that. That even now, so many years later, we're actually able to sense that same feeling, perhaps in a more diluted way, but we're still able to feel to some degree that feeling of being in dire straits, narrow straits, where we have to make our way carefully, try to get through this period of time without missing out what it is that it's meant to be doing to us. It's fabulous that it worked so well and it continues to work so well, which itself is indicative of just how important it is that we remain sensitive to that very visual, being caught in a narrow pass with enemies running behind you and just trying to survive. How important it is for us to be sensitive to the fact that the Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed. And it's that importance that obviously led our Chachamim to try to come up with a system that would actually work for so many years, that even with the passage of time, we should still be able to sense it actually. In a lesser form, yes, but we're still able to sense it actually, the Churban Habayis. It's interesting that the Avodas Yisrael has a very different read of that same pasuk. All those who pursued them were able to catch them in those narrow straits. The Avodas Yisrael learns the pasuk so differently that it almost makes us wonder. He learns as follows: all those who seek out Hashem, can catch it in this period of time that we refer to as Bein HaMetzorim. And it just seems so strange. Anything you would imagine at the time that we are trying to focus on the Churban, which is the cause for all of the distance between ourselves and Hashem, called the Hester Panim, the hiddenness of Hashem's presence so that it's not readily available, is all this time period. Shivasa B'Tammuz all the way to Tish'a B'Av. Why would the Avodas Yisrael view the pasuk in such an almost polar opposite way? Kol Reitveh Yisigua, all those who are chasing after Hashem, catch him. Bein HaMetzorim, in this period of time when we're going through these narrow streets. clearly he understood something about the Churban that also needs to be appreciated. That is to say, almost two polar opposite approaches, two polar opposite sensitivities, let's call it, towards the Churban. One is the simple reading of the pasuk: we are in dire straits. And we have to recognize that all those who were chasing us were able to catch us when we were going through these dire straits. The other is, this is incredible, anyone who is chasing after Hashem during this period of time is able to catch it. So different, almost polar opposites, and yet clearly both of them are important in order for us to be able to fully take in what it is that this period of time is meant to give. Now, the main focus, in terms of the practical of this time period, is, of course, the Avelis, the mourning. And mourning itself is a very interesting concept because it has its partner, which is called Nechama, which is the comfort. And although we tend to view the mourning as one and the comforting as the other, and comforting somehow undoes the mourning, that's how we tend to view it, we all know experientially that that's actually not, in fact, how it works. We go to be menachem, we go to do the comforting of those who are in mourning. We are menachem the avelu, which means that the nechama aspect, the comforting, doesn't take away the mourning. It's something that goes hand in hand with the mourning. When one will be in a state of mourning, we now come and attempt to find nechama. But he's still mourning. Yes, he is still in a state of mourning, and we are attempting to share with him a something that will give him a degree of comfort, even while he is mourning. And Tish'a B'Av is no different. The halachas of Tish'a B'Av and all the days leading up to Tish'a B'Av, and as the Rav pointed out, the day after, what we call a Siri B'Av, they revolve all around Avelis, mourning, both in practice and also in sense. We talk with a subdued voice, we follow the halachas of the mourning, the lights are dim, and simultaneously, we are focusing on the nechama. So much so that the nachem tefillah is part of the Tish'a B'Av tefillah. Hashem, please give us this comfort. And of course, immediately following Tish'a B'Av, we start with the haftarahs of the nechama. And so we have to get a little bit of a handle on what exactly does it mean to be in mourning, and what exactly does it mean to receive nechama. When you add to that the fact that halacha, practical halacha, recognizes and accepts as a practical fact that a shmua rechoika, that is to say, mourning over something that has happened already a while ago, is totally different than regular avelis. And if you think about it, just in your own experience, you will know that this is true. If I turn to you and I say, you know that in 1867, I saw it on one of these, in 1867, your great-great-great-grandfather died on this day. Now mourn. Would anybody be able to do that? The answer is no, of course not. It's very difficult to mourn for something that you have no sense of mourning about. And that's the whole halachic principle of a shmur rechoika, where the news of the death of a loved one comes further down the line, and indeed the halachas of avelis are very different. And yet when it comes to the Churban Beis HaMikdash, to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, it does not matter how shmur rechokaized you are, whether it's 1 year, whether it's 10 years, whether it's 100 years, or whether it's 2,000 years, you are somehow or another expected to mourn as if you heard about it yesterday. And the question is, how is that possible? Not only would we be able to ask, how is that possible? Let's ask the question even more. It should indeed be impossible. Unless we have a misconception about what the catalyst for mourning is. If we understand that the catalyst for mourning, that is to say, the underlying element of mourning is the grief and the sadness, then indeed it would be impossible. It's not possible to suffer the grief or sadness over someone who died 5 years ago, let alone a Beis Hamikdash that was destroyed 2,000 years ago. It's just not possible. And so if we're going to view Avelis as being purely the sadness and the grief, then Avelis on Tish'a B'Av would have to be one of two things. One, artificial, which of course we're not willing to accept. The other is that we deflect it onto other things that we can't feel grief about. That is to say, instead of actually mourning and being grief-stricken over the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, we carry over that destruction to things that are closer to home, that we are still, yes, able to feel grief for, and we make that the focus of our Tish'a. And indeed, this is something that we tend to do. We spend our Tish'a B'Av day reading about the Holocaust, reading about the terrible things that have befallen Klal Yisrael, all of which are a consequence of the Churban, but not the actual Churban. And the reason why we do this is because we are desperately searching for that grief that we know we're supposed to have, but is also impossible to have because the Churban Abayis is not something that we can relate to. It's a Shmur Rechoka on steroids. And so we feel, okay, so if I can't get the grief, let me find a way that I could get the grief. And so instead of focusing on the actual Churban, we focus on the consequences of the Churban, assuming that they aren't too much in the past. And then we can even feel the grief that we believe we're supposed to be feeling, because after all, we're in a state of mourning. And mourning is grief. And there is no grief for a Shmur Rechoka. And this is a Shmur Rechoka. I have to figure out how to have the grief. Here is a way that I can have it. Now, while that happens to be a very good thing to do, it's clear just from the way that I showed it that that can't possibly be what the Avelis on the Churban Abayis is meant to be. That could be an offshoot of it, but that can't be what the actual Avelis, the actual mourning, was intended to be. And therefore, it would seem that our starting point, namely that mourning is a direct outgrowth of grief, is not 100% correct. And rather, there is something entirely different that is the groundwork for mourning, one that is as relevant to the Beis Hamikdash's destruction as it is for someone who died just yesterday. And it's that underlying element of mourning that I want to share with you. A person's life, we're going to use that as an example. A person's life can be viewed as a construction of, you know, those magnetic piles that kids play with? What are they called? Magnetiles, thank you. Magnetiles, right? Magnetiles come in all sorts of shapes, come in all sorts of colors. Big squares, little squares, holes with windows. And a person's life is really just a construction made up of magnetiles. Every person that we meet, every experience that we have, every place that we go, every event that we are a part of is just another tile from which we construct a full picture about what we call our life. Now, some of those tiles are going to be the big square ones. Some of those tiles are going to be the little guys. Some of those tiles are going to be with holes in them. But when you put all of them together over the course of a person's life, that construction is the person's life. Now imagine, again, just usually using the magnet tiles as a visual aid. Imagine that you're viewing your life as a construction made up of all these little different tiles, big ones of magnet tiles, and I come in and I find the little one that's sort of like on the top, not very important, and I pull it out. Nothing happens. The structure pretty much remains the same. A little tiny tile, you pulled it out. But what happens if I pull out one of the big square ones all the way up the bottom? I just pull it out. What happens to the entire structure? The entire structure collapses. And now what you have is a pile of all of those tiles laying around in a mess. And you somehow have to be able to gather them back up and rebuild this construct made up of all the magnet tiles, except now you're going to have to build it without that big square one that I pulled out. That is exactly what Avelis is. Avelis isn't the grief and the sadness that results from someone's death. There is indeed grief and sadness, but that's not Avelis. Avelis is when one of those big square tiles have been pulled out and the whole thing comes down in a mess and collapses. Let's use one's parent as an example. A person's life is totally predicated on their parent. It revolves around. Everything that they are is built upon. There is nothing about their life that doesn't have something that ties back to their parent. Now a parent dies, the whole thing falls apart. And the person's entire life is now momentarily in a state of collapse. That's the state of mourning. The unhinged state, the recognition that your whole entire reality has just collapsed around you, leaves one in a state of shock, incapacitated, all of those things that we always associate with grief, because most often, or more often than not, they are a corollary to grief, but they're not grief itself. All of those things is the state of mourning. Now, how does a person pick themselves up? When you're in that kind of a collapse and your whole world has fallen apart around you, how would you go about picking yourself up? Well, it's a system. And that system is called practicing the Avelis. Let's try to use the house of an oval as an example. What happens in the house of an oval? So the oval is sitting there on the floor, and people are coming. And what do they do when they are coming? They're talking. And what are they talking about? The one who has just died. Now you understand that in the course of doing exactly that, what really is happening is you are able to bring back in memory, but you're able to bring back that collapsed tile sufficiently so as to be able to regain your footing, regain your equilibrium, to a point where you will be able to regather all the remaining tiles and rebuild that magnetile edifice that you started. This is what we call, in memory, it still lives. And that is a very true point. By virtue of the fact that you are sitting and reminiscing and talking, laughing, crying, all about the one who is no longer there, he is suddenly there more than in any other way that could possibly be true once he has died. You have brought him back, so to speak, sufficiently to be able to cope with the collapsed life around you. And as you cope with that collapsed life around you, and you're able to do that thanks to the fact that he who is gone is now present again, you're able to slowly regather, regroup, rebuild. And you take all the remaining tiles and you put them back together. True, that tile is no longer there, but you put all the remaining tiles back together, rebuild, and now you're able to move on. That's what we call necham. Not comfort, just reconstruct. Is there comfort in reconstruction? Yes. But you're not comforted over the loss of he who has died. You are in a state of comfort because you have managed to reconstruct. You're not in a state of collapse any longer. This was the whole principle behind establishing laws of mourning when somebody dies. How else am I going to be able to get a person back onto their own 2 feet when a parent has died? How does one bounce back from that? The answer is through Avelis. The mourning itself is how you bounce back. And so the Nechama emerges from the Avelis. From the very practice of the mourning, through that emerges the Nechama, where the life has been rebuilt. It's different, no question about it, but it's been rebuilt. It's enough to be able to cope, to keep on going. And so indeed, Avelis now simply brings on the state of Nechama. The Beis HaMikdash, the Klal Yisrael, is as vital as a parent is to any given individual. Our entire world revolves around the Beis HaMikdash. Our entire Torah, the existence of Klal Yisrael and how it all works, revolves figuratively, revolves literally around the Beis HaMikdash. Everything is predicated on it. Everything comes back to it. And now in walk the enemies, and they rip out that magnetile, and the entire edifice collapses. That state of collapse has not changed in 2,000 years. The grief maybe has, but the state of collapse has not. It's as much in a state of collapse today as it was 2,000 years ago. And therefore, being able to be in a state of Avelis now is as real and as tangible and as immediate as it was 2,000 years ago. No, not grief, not sadness. That's true. That you're not going to necessarily or even possibly feel. But the collapse, you can still feel as real today as you would have the day after the Churban, because the collapse is as real. So how does Klal Yisrael continue to function when everything is in a state of collapse? Well, by utilizing the same exact system that we use for all states of collapse. It's called Avelis. By practicing the laws of Avelis, We sit on the floor, the lights are dim, and we are talking. And what are we talking about? The Beis Hamikdash. What it was like when it was there, what it is, how terrible it is without it, how sad it was, the destruction that went with it. We are doing exactly what we do in any house of mourning. We are bringing the lost one back in memory sufficiently so that it still lives. And so the Avelis of Tish'a B'Av is exactly what Avelis always is. It is true that usually Avelis also has an element of grief and sadness, but that's only an also. But the underlying principle of Avelis, that is to say, that through reminiscing and talking and remembering, we bring it back to life, so to speak, thus propping up until we're able to ultimately cope. That is exactly the same whether it is somebody who died yesterday, or whether it is a Beis Hamikdash that was destroyed 2,000 years. And here too, the Nechama emerges through the Avelis. It's not back. The tile is still missing. But through the Avelis, we're able to prop it up enough to cope, to move on, to be able to survive, even though this fundamental tile has been taken out of our national edifice. We can still cope. How? By practicing Avelis. Because the point of Avelis, to sum it up, is bring back in memory so that it still lives. The Mela says the Avodas Yisrael, that all those who chase after him, who pursue Hashem during this period of time, will catch him, makes perfect sense. There is no time in our year that the Beis Hamikdash is as alive as it is when we are mourning. In the same way that there is no time after a person's death that they are as alive as during the days of mourning that follow its death. Because in the memory comes back the light. And so this period of time, which is a time of Churban, is indeed the time that we are most living with a real Beis Hamikdash. It's not tangible, but it's alive. And what makes it alive? The fact that we are sitting in a state of mourning so as to bring it back to life. Back to life through the act of mourning. There is no time in the year where the Beis Hamikdash is as real, as tangible, as alive, as so much in our focus, as on Tish'a B'Av. It's the one time a year that a Jew actually feels like, oh, the Beis Hamikdash, as if you're in it. As it always is, with all kinds of mourning. And so says Avodas Yisrael, if you had the Beis Hamikdash, and you came running to the Beis Hamikdash to catch Hashem, would you not automatically be able to catch him? Sure you would. Excellent. This is as close as you're going to get until it's rebuilt. When? When is the time that you will most likely catch him? Bein HaMetzorim. When you bring that Beis Hamikdash back to life through the process of mourning. And so the Avelis of Tish'a B'Av, it's not focusing on the grief and the sadness that comes from the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. Focusing on the state of a collapse. Is there also what to be full of grief and sadness about? Yes. For indeed, all of our catastrophes are a direct consequence of the Churban. Is that something that we should be focusing on Tish'a B'Av? Absolutely. But not because I need to make myself feel sad, but because I can use it as a way to appreciate what the Beis Hamikdash is and was, and thus, in that way, bring it back in as much a form as is possible through any state of mind. All right, there he's simply because it's the one time that you will actually walk through the gates of the Beis Hamikdash, even before it is rebuilt. But there's another possible explanation for what the Avodas Yisrael meant. And I want to share that also, even though it's not so much focused on the Avelis, but it is also an important element of Tish'a that needs to be appreciated. There is a famous mashal, a parable, or maybe I would call it an analogy, that is brought down in the name of the Arizal. And the Arizal says as follows. He says, imagine, subject comes to his queen in her palace, and she's surrounded by the grandeur of her palace. Chandeliers, the thrones, the tapestries, the carpets, the lights, fireplaces. And she's wearing her crown and her jewels, and he brings her a fur coat as a gift. Now, she's a queen, so of course she accepts it very graciously. But both the giver and the receiver recognize that nothing really was exchanged over it. It's a fur coat to the queen who's living in this kind of grandeur. She probably has a closet full of them. But now imagine, says the Arizal, that the very same subject comes to the very same queen, only this time she was married to Henry VIII, and therefore she found herself not in her palace, but in a cell in the tower that is cold and drafty and moldy and leaky. And he brings her this same exact fur coat. And she's a queen, so of course she accepts it very graciously. Only now, both the giver and the receiver recognize that something incredible has just happened. Says the Arizal, you'll notice that in the mashal, the queen is the same queen, the subject is the same subject, the coat is the same coat, and the graciousness is the same graciousness. What's changed? The only thing that's changed is, where is she? Is she in her palace with all of its grandeur? Where there the fur coat, it's very meaningful, but we have to put it into context. Or is she in a cell in the tower, drafty and cold, where there it's very meaningful, and we have to put that into context. But the only thing that changes between the two events is where the queen is. Says the Arizal, when Beis Hamikdash is built, and the Shekhinah is living in the Beis Hamikdash with all of its grandeur, and the Jew comes and he offers his services to the Shekhinah. I will dedicate my life. So of course it's accepted with graciousness, but let's put it in context. In this type of grandeur, with this type of Gilui Shekhinah, yes, it's very wonderful. And now imagine that we have to come to that very same Shekhinah with the very same gifts, with being the very same kind of subject, only now the Shekhinah is in Golus, cold, drafty, leaky. Now it's a totally different gift, and it is accepted in a totally different way. Says the Arizal, the gifts that Klal Yisrael give the Beirei while in Golus cannot be compared in their magnitude to those that are given while the Shekhinah is in the Beis Hamikdash. According to this mashal, perhaps that's what the Avodas Yisrael is saying. If you are still pursuing Hashem, you're still pursuing Him, even in the tribulations of Golus, in these dire straits of Golus, you will most definitely catch it. If you're still pursuing the Shekhinah, even when the Shekhinah is in this cold and drafty, and you're still giving yourself to it, even in the Golus, how much more so that you will catch it. And so, Korei Tvehi Sigua, specifically Bein HaMitzvot, the more the dire straits are, and yet there you are still standing there with the fur coat to give it as a gift to the queen, how much more so that you're going to catch it. And this second way of looking at this Avodas Yisrael has practical ramifications as well. In the same way that the first way had practical ramifications in terms of how it is that we can approach the actions of mourning and the words that we say on Tish'a. The second one also has practical ramifications. The Gemara in Tainus tells over an interesting ma'aseh, whether it means it literally, whether it means it figuratively. There's a machlokes among the Mefarshim. But the Gemara says as follows, that when the enemies came and they were surrounding the Beis HaMikdash, groups and groups of young Kohanim went up to the roof of the Beis HaMikdash, holding the keys of the gates to the Beis HaMikdash in their hands, and they said as follows. They said, Hashem, we did not merit to be worthy wardens of your gates. Here are the keys. You have to take care of it. And they threw the keys up, and the Gemara says something that was like the palm of a hand came and caught those keys. One of the most poignant piyutim that we say on Yom Kippur during the last tefillah of Ne'ilah is Pesach lanu shar ve'es Ne'ilah shar. Open up a gate at that time, precisely when the gates are locked. Pesach lanu shar. Open up for us the gate. Ve'es Ne'ilah shar, at the time that the gates are being locked. That is a tefillah that is so fabulous that even thinking about it is enough to bring one to tears. Pesach lanu shar, not throughout the day, but no, as you're locking the gates, that's when we're asking you to open it anyway. Now, of course, in Ne'ilah, we're talking about the closing of the gates of Yom Kippur, but Tish'a B'Av also was a time where the gates were closed, locked, and the keys thrown away. And in exactly the same way that we can ask Pesach lanu shar ve'es Ne'ilah shar on Yom Kippur, how much more so that we should be able to make the same exact request on Tish'a B'Av when the gates themselves were locked and the Kohanim took the keys and threw them away. And so what we're basically saying is, on Tish'a B'Av, saying, Ribono Shel Olam, we're in this draft coldy cell with you called Golus. We're still here trying to give you this fur coat. It's the same queen, the same fur coat, the same subject, only now we're in this context, and we're still trying to give you that coat. Pesach lanu shar, even though the gates are closed, even though they've been locked and the keys thrown away, nonetheless, Pesach lanu shar. And having as much a living Beis HaMikdash, and recognizing that even in Golus, it is still possible to access that kind of a relationship with the Vayir, even within the context of Golus. Person asks for that. Pesach lanu shar ve'es Ne'ilah shar. Takes such advantage of being in this kind of a living Beis Hamikdash, even though it is not tangible and immediate and real. And perhaps that's what we can walk away with at the end of Tish'a. Yes, the Beis Hamikdash is still not rebuilt. Yes, the Shekhinah is still in Golas, but at least it was alive for a day. It was alive. And while it was alive, I was able to walk into it, so to speak. I was able to access it. I was able to be in it. I was able to relate to the Shekhinah as if it's in it. I was able to ask it, to be Pesach Shar, even at the time that the gates are locked. And that will carry us through, prop us up. Hopefully to never again, to another Tish'a. But should we have the misfortune of needing to wait for another Tish'a, so will carry us through till the next Tish'a. Or once again, we will do exactly the same process, bring it back to life, walk back through its doors again. Then as its gates are being locked and the keys are being thrown back up to the sky, make the same demand. Until we are zeicher that the Beis Hamikdash is actually built. Then we won't have to do the mourning any longer. Amen.
Comment of Midas the whole Tish'a. Tell me. Okay, there we go. Very good. Fast. Amen. Wow. Beautiful.